Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's equal parts bizarre, heartbreaking, and depending on how your last relationship went, possibly inspiring. Forget what Hollywood told you about soulmate, because sometimes real love doesn't look like kisses in the rain or tearful apologies at airport gates. Sometimes it looks like two people sharing the same bathroom for 40 years without speaking a single word. So before you get too comfortable, do me a quick favor, hit that like button if you enjoy these strange human stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who else is staying up late for this one. Now dim the lights and maybe pour a drink, because what you're about to hear might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about love, hate, and the fine art of passive aggression. Let's begin. You wake up in a house that hasn't changed in at least 2 presidential terms, maybe more. The air smells like decaf and dust. Not a thick, neglected kind of dust, a soft, settled kind. The kind that gently lines the tops of door frames and the slats of the blinds, like it was invited there, a respectful, domestic dust. The kind that only gathers in places no one's really looked at in years. Your feet hit the linoleum in the kitchen with that familiar hollow sound. Somewhere in this house there is a floorboard that creaks like a horror movie when you step on it at 3 a.m. You know exactly which one. You step around it now by instinct. It's fall now. As it looks, the calendar above the fridge is turned to the right month, but no days are marked. That stopped a long time ago. You don't celebrate birthdays anymore. You haven't had to buy a card in years. Your spouse is here. She's in the other room, or maybe she's still in the bedroom taking her time getting dressed. You hear movement, not words. She's always present. That's the strange part, really, or that you left her. The two of you are still locked in orbits, still refilling the Brita without saying a word. You even argue, just not with language. She moves the sugar jar slightly out of reach. You leave the remote facing the wrong direction. Little declarations of tension in object form. The silence didn't come with a thunderclap. No slammed doors, no tears streaking down a cheek in soft lighting. It was gradual, slow enough that you didn't notice it was happening until it already had. You tried to remember the last actual sentence you said to her. It was so ordinary that it doesn't deserve to be a historical marker. Something like, "We're out of milk." Not exactly the kind of phrase you expect to be your final words in a marriage. But that was the tone of things, always functional, always moving forward by inertia. Back then, you were tired of the kids always needing something, of your job sucking the light out of your chest, like furniture, like one of the old chairs. And when you tried to say that to her, when you hinted at the shapeless thing eating at your pride, she didn't react, not the way you wanted. She looked tired too, but she didn't ask questions. She didn't comfort. She made a note to pick up peanut butter and went to bed. So you said nothing the next day, and she said nothing too. That was over 20 years ago. Now you live in a world of gestures. You bang the cupboard a little too loud when you want to make a point. She rinses your coffee mug with a little more force than necessary. The living room, a ceasefire zone. But here's the kicker. Love doesn't disappear just because language does. If anything, it grew weirder, more complex. You began to love her in new, speechless ways. Like how she always left exactly 2 napkins on the tray when she brought you your sandwich. How she never forgot that you preferred grape jelly, even when she bought it begrudgingly. Or how you made sure to scrape her windshield in winter quietly, before she woke up. You didn't announce it. You didn't look for praise. Because even in silence, there were rules. And because the world outside your home never knew, the silence stayed sacred. Neighbors waved when they saw you walking together. Church ladies whispered what a stable couple you were. You mowed the lawn every Saturday. She watered the azaleas. No one asked about your conversations. They didn't need to, because you looked fine. And fine, as everyone knows. At first, they thought it was a phase, that their parents were having some weird midlife tiff, and would go back to arguing like everyone else. But you didn't. You outlasted them. They started translating for you around age 7. Dad, Mom says she's making chicken tonight. Dad says he's making chicken tonight. You just nodded. You looked at your children, wide-eyed and confused, trying to carry the emotional weight of 2 adults who had both refused to blink first. Eventually, they gave up to moved out, married, had kids of their own, and when those kids ask, they weren't angry like everyone else. But what no one sees, what only you know, is that silence becomes a comfort after long enough, like a wall blanket that itches at first, then warms you in a way nothing else can. You stopped missing her voice years ago. What you miss instead is the way she used to laugh at dumb commercials, or the way she used to talk in her sleep. You still worry when she coughs a certain way. You still know the look in her eye. That means her back is acting up, and she notices you too. You can feel it. That's why you never left. Not even during the roughest parts. Not even when your brother called and said, "Why are you still there, man? Move out. Start fresh." You didn't want fresh. You wanted familiar. And familiar, however bruised was her. The town changed. New gas station. Post office moved. They shut down the Sears, then the library, then the bowling alley. But the house stayed the same. The one constant in a county that kept shedding pieces of itself. And through all of it you were both still there. Quiet, unchanged. Like stubborn old roots. Sometimes, in the very early morning, when the sun hasn't crept through the curtains yet, and everything is blue and grey and liminal, you think about breaking it, saying something, anything. Maybe just a good morning, or a sarcastic still alive, huh? Just to see what she'd do. But you never do, because the silence isn't just silence anymore. It's an artifact, a monument to a wound that was never stitched, but also never bled out. You wonder if she thinks about it too, and one day though you can't place when you notice something different. Subtle. You both linger longer at the dinner table, not looking at each other, not touching, but present. There's something hanging in the air. A possibility. Maybe it's age, maybe it's mortality, creeping up with its long creaky knees, and its soft reminders that nothing lasts forever, not even standoffs. But you still don't say anything. Not yet. You just refill her glass of water, like always, because, despite what people think, it's full of unsaid things, and you've both learned to live with the weight of every single one. There's a sound that only happens in your house, It not the floorboard that groans in the hallway, or the rattle of the old HVAC kicking in. It's the quiet. It's the kind of quiet that has posture, shape, edges. You live inside it like a second skin. There's a rhythm to your days now. Not a schedule, exactly, more of a dance. You wake at the same time, make the same coffee, feed the same dog, who has grown as used to the silence as you have. Even the dog doesn't bark anymore. He just huffs, then lays down again. You brush your teeth while she puts on her slippers in the next room. You hear her footsteps, the slow ones with a slight shuffle because of that knee she never had looked at. She hears yours, too, but never says a thing, never has to. She makes toast, always one slice. You make oatmeal. Neither of you ever asks the other if they want some, but the butter dish is always left open. The salt always set out between you. You sit at the kitchen table together, just like old times, only now the newspaper is a shared battleground. She reads the local section first. You get sport, editorials. You trade them silently. The dining room still has that same lace curtain, still smells vaguely like lemon cleaner, and something indefinable, maybe time, maybe resignation. There's a photo of the kids on the sideboard. They're young in it, smiling. You wonder if they remember that day the way you do, fighting over the radio station on the drive to the park, getting sunburned, even though she told them to wear hats. They never ask about you two anymore. The kids, that is, they stopped a few years back after their attempts at intervention fizzled. There were family therapy suggestions, invitations to church, retreats, even a misguided anniversary dinner where everyone got too drunk and the youngest blurted out, "Why don't you just divorce already?" Neither of you responded, not because you didn't have anything to say, but because you knew, instinctively, that saying it out loud would diminish it. You stayed, and so did she. There's something comforting in that now. Familiarity, its presence, tuned to a different frequency. She still hums, sometimes, under her breath. Not often, but you hear it when she's chopping vegetables or folding laundry. A little melody, off-key and half remembered. You don't know the song, but you know the feeling. You fix things around the house. The door that sticks in winter. You don't tell her you've done it, but you notice the way she pauses in the doorway, just long enough to register the change. That's all you need. Sometimes she does small things too, not grand gestures, but subtle shifts in the environment that tell you she's been thinking. A new kind of tea in the cupboard, a different brand of toothpaste, the one you used to like. She's not doing it for herself. You remember once finding your old winter coat mended, a tear under the arm, just hanging there in the hall closet like it had always been whole. You wore it every day that season. In the evenings, the living room becomes neutral territory. The television is always on, but low. Neither of you watches it with any real attention. It's just there, making noise, so the quiet can stretch and yawn without breaking. She sits in the chair by the window, not deliberately, not consistently, but enough to remind you. Every so often, your hands brush while reaching for the same popcorn bowl. There's a flicker of something recognition, maybe, but no words. You just shift, recalibrate, return to your corners. If anyone else saw you someone untrained in the art of marriage. But that's the thing. Silence doesn't mean suffering. Not always. Sometimes it's protection. A treaty signed with no pen. You think about other couples sometimes. The ones in TV shows. Loud, dramatic, always working through something. You wonder how many of them survive the noise, the need to be understood. You gave that up a long time ago. Understanding isn't spoken. It's felt. Like when she hands you your reading glasses before you even ask. Or when you leave the porch light on. When she's out late, you can't sleep. The house feels heavy with memory, and the only light is the single bulb above the workbench. You run your fingers across old tools. Half of them haven't been used in years. You find a box marked Thanksgiving decorations in her handwriting. You stare at it longer than you should. The letters curved the way they used to in her notes. Neat, practical, just a little. She used to write you lists. Things to pick up from the store, notes about appointments. You saved some of them, though you'd never admit that to anyone. They're in a drawer somewhere, mixed in with tax papers and warranty cards. You keep them not because they're poetic, but because they're hers. And they had her voice in them, even when it stopped being spoken. The town around you has grown quieter too. The neighbors are mostly gone, replaced by new families with big dogs and louder music. You don't mind. You sit on the porch and watch them go by, unnoticed. She joins you sometimes, usually on Sundays after the sun has started to dip, but before the mosquitoes come out in full force. You sit in those old white chairs, paint peeling, armrests, smooth from decades of use. She brings tea, you bring the bug spray. You never speak, but somehow it feels like the most honest part of your week. Every once in a while, not staring, and in those moments, there's a thread connecting you, a thread made not of sound, but of shared years. You've weathered things, losses, the death of her sister, the heart attack scare 3 winters ago. Each event was met with the same ritual. After the hospital, she laid out your slippers and reheated your dinner without meeting your eyes. That was her way of saying, "I'm glad you're alive." You took out the trash that night and made sure the salt was in the driveway. Before the snow started, that was yours. You wonder sometimes what the neighbors say, if they guess, if they whisper, but it doesn't matter. You know the truth. This house is quiet, but it's not empty. It's a museum of gestures, a cathedral of unspoken forgiveness. You still sleep in the same bed, sometimes with pillows between you, but you're there. And that means something. Shouting and spinning and demanding reaction. In your shared silence, there's control, calm, certainty. It may not be the kind of marriage people write about in novels, but it's yours. It works. It endures. And in a world that constantly asks for explanations, for declarations, for content, maybe that's the rarest kind of connection there is. The silence was inherited, not by intention, not like a family heirloom wrapped in tissue paper and passed across generations, but through atmosphere, through prolonged exposure. Like mold or radiation, he had grown up Inside it their son, the middle child, the most watchful, the one who noticed things even when he pretended not to. He knew which floorboard meant his father was up. He knew what it sounded like when his mother pressed the cabinet door closed. He had learned to read volume and breath instead of tone and language. And from the beginning, it unsettled him. As a child, he assumed they whispered when he wasn't around, that they saved their words for private hours, sacred and unseen. But the older he got, their silence was not a performance. It was structural, not a choice, a condition. In other homes, parents argued, laughed, made noise. Here, everything was quiet, except for the clatter of plates. Their marriage had the texture of a permanent ceasefire. He developed a nervous habit-filling space. He would talk at the dinner table. He performed at family gatherings, overly bright, as though by sheer force of personality he might generate enough warmth to melt the frost between his parents. He asked questions and answered them himself. He narrated his life in real time. No one interrupted. He just kept going. Later, as a teenager, he grew resentful. At school, when friends spoke of their parents' embarrassing habits, their dad jokes, their mom lectures, he said little. He had no equivalent. His house wasn't a sitcom, it was a museum. The kind with roped-off furniture and signs that said do not touch. By college, the resentment had hardened into something heavier. Not hatred, just frustration, calcified by time. It turned into a question that curled inward like a hook. Why? No one had ever answered. Not his sisters, not his aunts, who smiled politely and suggested he be grateful they're still together. Not even his therapist, who had smiled with professional warmth and asked how the silence had made him feel, as though the answer were hidden somewhere in the folds of his memory, waiting to be dusted off. He asked himself constantly, was it punishment, a ritual, a test, or had nothing happened at all? He tried, for a while, to break it. He left books on communication on the coffee table. He asked them questions that required more than a nod. He created scenarios that begged for speech, but all of it fell away like rain on stone. So he stopped trying to fix them and focused instead on trying to understand them. He began observing them as if they were specimens in a slow, domestic experiment. He watched how his father always refilled the bird feeder after his mother's walks. How his mother always folded his father's flannel shirts differently from the others, with more precision, more care. How they never touched but always moved in sync. There was love here, he realized. Just not the kind that made noise. Years passed. He married a woman who found his family dynamic fascinating at first, then deeply unsettling. She didn't understand how two people could live like that, parallel, wordless, enduring. She used words like unhealthy and emotional stunting, and grew impatient when his parents visited. Eventually, he never stopped visiting. Not even after their own marriage began to show cracks. The visits became ritual twice a month, always on Sundays. He didn't explain the silence to his kids. He wanted them to ask. They always did, usually within the first 15 minutes. He never had a real answer for them, only the same phrases he'd been using for years, light-hearted. He didn't want them to grow up inside that silence. But he also didn't want them to be afraid of it. He tried once more, in his late 30s, to understand it by documenting it. He began writing everything down. Not just memories, small moments that struck him as meaningful, even if he couldn't explain why. The way his mother always closed the bathroom door, even when no one was around. The way his father's chair creaked twice before settling. The sound of the cutlery drawer opening at exactly the same time. Each evening, these things felt like clues. Maybe not to a mystery, but to a truth. The truth, however, remained elusive. Eventually, he took the story outside the house. Not to friends they'd heard enough. Not to therapists he was tired of being asked about feelings. He took it where he thought it might actually land. To television. At first, it was local news. A human interest reporter. He submitted their story under a pseudonym. It didn't go anywhere. Too strange, too quiet. No drama, no twist, just silent. But then a national daytime show picked it up. A producer called, intrigued. The angle was unusual. A couple who had not spoken to each other in over 2 decades, yet had never separated, never divorced, never even argued. They saw it as a curiosity. He saw it as a breakthrough. He agreed. They offered to fly him and his parents out to New York. They wanted to do a segment, perhaps even a reunion. He hesitated, not because of the exposure, but because he wasn't sure how his parents would react, or if they'd react at all. He showed up at their house that week. The air was as quiet as ever. His mother was pruning the porch plants. His father was reading something old. He left the printed email on the kitchen counter. But the week after, a van arrived. Not their idea. His. The producers had insisted on filming a home visit. They wanted to see the couple in their natural habitat. See how they moved, how they interact. Door didn't. He warned them not to expect anything dramatic. They came anyway. They brought lights, cameras, makeup, and a host whose smile never wavered. They arranged the house like a movie, set polishing, staging, softening. The living room looked like itself, only shinier. The crew kept waiting for some spark and outburst, a tear, anything they could edit into a moment, but it never came. The couple sat, composed, present, still. The camera caught everything and revealed nothing. Their silence did not perform. Eventually, the host tried, prompting them with questions about marriage, about time, about regret. Neither of them answered, not rudely, completely. The producers shifted tactics. They filmed the son instead. Asked him about what it had been like growing up, how it felt now. He gave them answers, thoughtful ones, a little practiced, a little pained. He hoped they'd be enough. When the segment aired, it was a curiosity, a blip in the endless scroll of daytime television. Viewers wrote in. A few confessed that they understood it completely. The couple didn't watch the show. The son did. He recorded it. Looked for things he hadn't seen in real life, small expressions, fleeting glances, anything he could call progress. He found one. Just before the credits rolled, there was a moment, barely a second long, when his father looked at his mother. Really looked. Not through her, not past her, not around her, at her. It was a blink of recognition, just acknowledgement, and that, for the son, was enough. It didn't unravel the mystery. It didn't change the past, but it was something He stopped asking questions after that. He still visited, still brought the kids, still sat on the porch with his father, but he no longer tried to break the silence. He just let it be. And in the years that followed, the house remained the same. Quiet, familiar, steady. He would never know why they stopped talking. He accepted that now. But he knew something else. They had never stopped listening. The mailbox still creaked. That particular sound hadn't changed in 30 years. The low metallic groan as the lid, followed by the soft hump of letters sliding in. Then, silence again. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt curated, maintained, as if the entire house had been trained, like a pet, to obey the rules of quiet, outdoors. The world had grown louder. Cars now purred instead of roared, yet somehow made more noise. The neighbor's teenager had mounted subwoofers to the back of his hybrid. Delivery drivers, dropping packages that neither of them had ordered. Day seemed to bring a new piece of plastic-wrapped future to someone else's porch. Inside, the silence had outlived nearly everything. It had outlasted wallpaper styles, coffee brands, dial-up internet, all the kitchen appliances, except the original toaster, and at least 3 pairs of slippers. The silence had settled so deep into the walls that even the houseplants seemed to sway more softly in its presence. Still, there were days when the outside world pressed in more aggressively than others. Like the day the power went out across half the county, a transformer blew during a freak April storm, and the restoration crew was stretched too thin to prioritize their little street. Without the soft hum of electronics, the house took on a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, not routine, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, of the sound your tongue makes against the roof of your mouth, of how loud a light switch sounds when it does nothing. During the blackout, they lit candles separately. One in the kitchen, one in the bedroom, one in the hallway. They moved through the house like caretakers in an old museum, careful, reverent, never overlapping. The refrigerator slowly warmed. The freezer started to bleed. Still, they didn't speak. They had lived through worse. In those days, he remembered how much noise the refrigerator normally made. It had always been background, a soft gurgle, a gentle kick. Now its silence was glaring. He imagined that if he leaned his ear against it, he could hear the last remaining molecules of cold air sighing into the void. The radio, battery-powered and dusty, came down from the shelf. She brought it out first, placed it on the kitchen counter, as if she'd known exactly where it had been waiting all these years. He noticed it that evening, tuned to the local AM station where the anchor still pronounced the town name with exaggerated pride. From then on, the house pulsed faintly, with voices not their own. Weather updates, old gospel songs, farm reports, political ads recorded by men who smiled with their teeth and lied through them. The voices never demanded anything. They didn't interrupt the silence. Each evening during the blackout, they sat near the windows as the sun faded. It reminded them of another time. Before central air, before television, before phones glowed and beeped. Every time someone posted a photo of their breakfast, candles flickered on the sill. Shadows stretched across the carpet like slow fingers, the sun called during the outage. drove over with supplies, a flashlight. He brought his youngest with him, who sprinted through the house with the excitement of someone visiting a secret planet. They watched the child run between the furniture, yelling into the silence, trying to provoke a reaction. There was none. Only smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. When the power returned 3 days later, the house exhaled. The lights blinked back to life. The refrigerator sighed with relief. The television glowed again, but for a while after, neither of them turned it on. There was a time every week, late Sunday afternoon, when the silence became more apparent. After the Sun's car had pulled away and the echoes of laughter from the children had dissolved into the yard, the house seemed to sag just slightly. Not sadly, not in grief, just adjusted. The laughter never stayed. It arrived like a wind gust, lifted everything a few inches off the ground. In those moments, they went about restoring the balance. Dishes were rinsed, toys returned to a storage bin in the hallway closet. The extra chairs pushed back under the table with their legs touching just so. Each act was a recalibration. He usually stepped out after, walked the block, not far, just enough to let his ears ring with something other than memory. She never asked where he went. He never offered. The neighbors had changed. New families had moved in on both sides. One of them had a trampoline in the backyard, always buzzing with small feet and occasional shrieks of joy. Once, he caught himself watching through the blinds. Not with longing, with curiosity, as though trying to remember what that kind of noise had once felt like. When he returned, she would have already folded the blankets from the couch. They would return to the same spaces they always occupied with the same settled weight. And yet, small changes had begun to bloom in the corners. Like the way she had started leaving the back porch light on, even when he didn't go outside, or how he had taken to boiling water for tea. Even on nights she wasn't tea in the kitchen. They didn't confirm, but slowly they re-entered each other's patterns. The mail kept coming, mostly bills, flyers. Once, a letter from a distant cousin with handwriting so shaky it looked like branches in a windstorm. Neither of them opened it for 2 days. When they finally did, it was a wedding invitation. Someone young, optimistic, with a Pinterest account and no sense of time. The ceremony was to be outdoors in a garden, with mason jar centerpieces. The invitation sat on the counter for a week, then another. Eventually, one of them recycled it. Neither spoke of it. They didn't need to. The rituals they kept were enough. Autumn returned. In that town, autumn never arrived gently. It thudded down in heavy winds and piles of brittle leaves. Trees that had stood green and aloof all summer now shed in reckless abandon. Everything became golden, then brown, then bare. They changed the filters, switched out the bedding. They didn't discuss it. The rhythm of the seasons had long since embedded itself in their bones. She took out the sweaters with the soft shoulders and the cardigans with buttons that didn't match. He rotated his jackets in the hall closet, left the heavy one closest to the door. They adjusted the thermostat together, in silence. There was a day that season a day neither of them had circled on a calendar when they both reached for the same drawer at the same time. Her hand grazed his, not urgently, just enough to notice. Neither flinched. They withdrew in the same breath, then moved on. That evening, When the lights were low and the television flickered in the corner, she paused slightly longer at the kitchen doorway before entering. He noticed, but he didn't turn. Not yet. Small things were starting to accumulate. A different brand of cereal. The faint scent of perfume she hadn't worn in years. He responded in kind. Replaced the batteries in the smoke detector, tightened the curtain rod, unclogged the bathroom drain she'd been silently tolerating for weeks. Each act was small. None of it said aloud, but it was conversation of a kind. The silence remained, but its edge softened. It was no longer a wall. It was a fabric, something that wrapped around them both, instead of dividing them. There's a kind of ache that settles into the body after 70. It's not sharp. It doesn't scream or cramp. It murmurs. It coils low in the spine, behind the knees, in the neck. When you lean too long over the sink, it waits, patient and constant, reminding you that time has moved through you whether you invited it in or not. He woke with it now, not from a bad mattress or a draft he. He long since solved those problems with extra blankets and careful sleep positions, but from the sheer weight of living inside the same body for decades. This, he thought, solid on the outside, but slowly, silently, hollowing inside. He rose slower these days. The mornings were colder than they used to be. The furnace still worked. The windows trembled when the wind rolled in off the hills. He stuck towels against the frames, and she double-aired the curtains. They never coordinated. Yet somehow, their fixes always met in the middle two halves of the same old instinct. In the kitchen, the rituals remained. The kettle now squealed louder. It had become part of the morning's landscape. She still folded the newspaper in half, clean and creased, and he still read it in segments, rotating it clockwise, like a puzzle with no real urgency. Outside, the neighborhood had changed again. The house next door, once owned by a couple. They'd nodded it for decades. The young man who lived there played video games loudly and cursed into his headset. They never complained, not because they weren't disturbed, but because the silence they kept wasn't just for each other anymore. It had become a shield between them, and the noise of a world they no longer recognized. Grocery trips had been reduced to bi-weekly events, coordinated in separate notebooks. Doctor appointments were written on a calendar. They each checked quietly, she wrote in blue. He preferred black ink. The notes never overlapped. On Sundays, the sun still came, always with something new, a story, a device, a suggestion. He carried an urgency in him, a subtle panic, as if he were running out of time to repair something he never broke. He brought their grandchildren when he could. The children filled the house with questions, movement, noise. They ran between furniture. They opened drawers. They broke things. He didn't mind. When they left, the house deflated. It returned to its usual stillness, which now felt slightly more hollow than before. It was during this season, deep into a grey November, that a small accident rearranged the shape of their silence. She had slipped. Nothing dramatic, just the wrong step on the cellar stairs. A jar of tomato preserves had fallen from her hands and shattered. In trying to avoid the glass, she twisted her ankle. He hadn't heard it happen. It was the kind of quiet that did not fit the usual pattern. Too complete. Not the familiar hush of a house in cooperation, but the vacuum left behind when something breaks. He found her sitting there, her hand pressed to her ankle. The spilled jar was a dark smear across the concrete. He didn't say her name. He simply moved, cleaned the floor, helped her up, slowly, supporting her under one arm. They moved as if rehearsed. She limped slightly, but made no sound. He brought the ice pack. Without needing to be told, she elevated her leg with the same decorative pillow she never allowed to be used on the couch. They spent the rest of the afternoon in their respective chairs, motionless. The television was on, but no one watched it. The sound was a low drone in the background, like a distant airport they'd never visit. That night, he checked on her. Not visibly. Not directly. He walked past her door 3 times, adjusting a painting, tightening a light bulb, rearranging the hallway rug that didn't need rearranging. She had left her lamp on. He noticed the soft glow under the door, and somehow, that was enough to let him exhale. The next morning, she was in the kitchen again. The broken jar was gone. The cellar door now had a note taped to it, written in neat handwriting, "Ask for help next time." She hadn't signed it. She hadn't needed to. He read it, stared at it, then made the coffee. Winter fell hard. The first snow came suddenly. The old maple near the porch shed a limb that cracked like gunfire in the early morning. She shoveled the walkway that afternoon. They didn't acknowledge each other. Their work overlapped. 2 movements toward the same result, never quite touching. He started writing things down again. Not like before, not lists or reminders, more like notes to himself, observations, questions he'd never asked. He kept a spiral-bound notebook in the garage, tucked behind the tool bench. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even legible half the time. But he filled it slowly, 1 line at a time. She, too, had begun to write again. He found traces of IT pages of recipes rewritten, words that meant little on their own but together formed evidence of thought, of presence, of attention, but their hands were speaking. A neighbor passed away in January. A woman 2 houses down, who had always maintained an impeccable rose garden and never let her trash cans sit on the curb more than an hour past pickup. She had lived alone for years. They heard about it from the mailboxer condolence card tucked among the flyers and bills, addressed. He read the note at the kitchen table. She lit a candle on the windowsill. That evening, they both sat in the living room longer than usual, not doing anything, just there. Just 2 shadows in armchairs, but it had carved away the edges. There were fewer sharp corners now, fewer grudges curled tightly in their stomachs. What had once been a stalemate had become a stillness, something close to peace. They were old now, not in the charming, playful sense, but in the way furniture becomes old steady, scarred, still standing. The silence no longer felt like something imposed. It felt like something chosen, a space they both occupied because they understood, better than anyone else, what lived within it. Not avoidance, not fear, but memory, and patience, and the quiet faith that some things, even when unspoken, are still heard. Winter had a way of magnifying silence. It gathered, in the corners of the house, like extra dust, padded the walls with stillness, made every creak in the floor feel deliberate. The snow outside muffled even the smallest sounds. No birds, no dogs barking, just white upon white. Inside the house, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. The room still smelled of cinnamon and radiator heat. The hallway nightlight still clicked on at exactly 4:45, triggered by the deep blue gloom of an early dusk. The thermostat remained at its habitual compromise between her cold feet and his thinning blood. But a softness had crept in, not like the softness of forgiveness, not quite. It was more like the loosening of a knot that no longer served a purpose. The tension that had once held them rigid was slowly giving way to something lighter, less defined. They weren't warming to each other in a cinematic way. There was no grand thaw, a mutual surrender to something quieter. He noticed she had started wearing that pale blue cardigan again, the one with the frayed sleeve and the missing button. It had always been his favorite, though he'd never said so. Not even before the silence began. He simply noticed it more than the others. The way it matched the sky in late October. The way the cuffs curled softly around her wrists. She had taken to humming again, the kind that wandered without resolve, as if she were tracing old roads in her memory. With her breath, he didn't recognize the tunes. They filled the house like steam-warm, fleeting proof of something alive inside. He had started rising earlier, before her, not by design, but by restlessness. Mornings now came with a flicker of purpose. He would turn on the stove, fill the kettle, set out her cup next to his, aligned just so, never with the intention of being thanked, only with the instinct of remembering. The paper still came, thick with advertisements. They never read. He separated the pages without crumpling them, placing the lifestyle section in her usual seat at the table. She did the same with the crossword when he wasn't looking. They still didn't speak, but their movements had become a kind of language, not fluent. That February, he knew it was there. The familiar trail from the porch to the shed, but the white erased it, buried it like a secret. It was during this time that she began leaving lights on, in quiet defiance. The hall lamp left glowing past midnight. The porch light, a small flame against the dark, as though the house needed more than it needed presence. He didn't turn them off. He simply replaced the bulbs faster. A storm came on a Thursday, one of those long, slow-moving fronts that coats everything with ice before the snow even arrives. The power flickered twice in the morning, then died completely by noon. A silence deeper than silence. They lit candles again, not together, but not separately either. Their movements had learned to echo. He watched the trees sway outside like old dancers, burdened by frozen limbs. The windows trembled with every gust. Somewhere in the basement, she boiled water on the gas burner, and the two of them sat in the kitchen, wrapped in sweaters, staring at the flickering shapes on the wall, like they were waiting for a message. Time passed differently without electricity. The clock on the stove blinked its final 12 o'clock and surrendered. They measured the hours instead by light through curtains, by the temperature of the tea, by the rhythm of their own breath. Without power, that he found her sitting at the dining table, long after he had assumed she'd gone to bed. She was surrounded by papers, letters, recipes, receipts. Years of domestic sediment spread across the table like an excavation site, laying them flat, arranging them into quiet lines. He watched from the hallway, unseen, for a long time. Something about the way she moved, slow, precise, almost reverent, held him still. Eventually, he returned to the living room, listened to the wind shake the window pane, and wondered if, perhaps, she had been writing to him all along. Just not in words. By March, the snow began to recede, slowly, in patches, first from the roof, then the driveway, then the garden bed, revealing the bent corpses of tulip shoots that had tried too early and failed. He cleaned them out without ceremony, hands stiff inside, cracked gloves. She stood at the window. The season changed as it always did, with mess and mud and fogged windows. The sun arrived in pieces, the ice shrank, and with them came something else. A memory. He had forgotten the date, an invitation to the high school's 50th reunion. His name printed cleanly, paired with hers, as if nothing unusual had ever passed between them. The envelope rested on the counter for days. They didn't respond. They didn't need to. The invitation remained unopened, but they began sitting closer in the evenings, not side by side, not dramatically, but closer. The two chairs that had once been angled away from each other began to inch toward parallel. The shared lamp between them became more than a boundary. It became a bridge. She started folding his laundry again. Not just his towels, not just the communal linens, but his shirts, his socks. She folded them with that same methodical crease she had used in their early years. He responded by fixing the sink leak in the bathroom. Not the obvious strip he had done that years ago, but the smaller hiss inside the pipes. The kind of fix that takes hours. The kind that no one notices, unless they're listening closely. It was around this time that the son stopped asking. He still came, still brought the grandchildren, still filled the rooms with energy that felt slightly foreign. But he no longer looked for signs. He no longer tried to translate the silence into progress. He had begun to see it as a language of its own, not one he spoke, but one he could finally respect. The house felt older now, not in structure, but in spirit. It held more ghosts than visitors, more echoes than conversations. But it was also warmer, somehow. Not physically there, were still cold spots in the hallway, and a stubborn chill near the back window, but warmer in presence. In intention, they moved more slowly, but always toward one another. It wasn't healing. It was something quieter than both, a rejoining as the snow gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way to green. They began preparing the garden again. She brought out the gloves, the spade, the packet of seeds she had saved from last year's. He tilled the soil. Neither asked the other to help, but when they worked in the garden, they worked as one. The sun stretched longer now. The birds returned in earnest. The house creaked not in protest, but in greeting. And in the middle of all this renewal, they remained together, wordless and entirely understood. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in their part of the country. One hesitant breeze at a time, one stubborn bud appearing on the old dogwood tree out front, still brittle from last winter storms. Grass returned in patches, then across the yard in quiet waves. The ice was gone. He adjusted the thermostat in the mornings with a little more frequency now, walking barefoot to the hallway and listening to the furnace breathed to life. Its sound had become something like company. Outside, birds began nesting under the eaves again. They made small chirps. Life crept back into the soil. She brought the window boxes down from the attic and filled them with fresh soil, her hands covered in damp earth, sleeves rolled halfway up her arms. He brought out the hose, tested the pressure. It sputtered at first, then ran clean. The routines expanded with the weather. Longer walks, longer silences. She trimmed the hedges. He repainted the mailbox post. She adjusted the storm windows. In these small tasks, the silence moved with them. It had become elastic, stretching when they moved apart, drawing back when they drew near. It let them breathe. And yet, a different quiet had begun to appear. A new kind. It wasn't between them. It was inside him. He had been forgetting things. Nothing dramatic, but little things. The way to the hardware store. The title of a book he'd read 6 times. The name of the neighbor who always waved when he mowed the lawn. A fog had begun to settle at the edge of his memory, not dense. At first, he tried to keep it from her. Not from shame, just from habit. He'd always been the one who remembered dates. It was not a role he'd ever spoken about, but it had been his. Now, he found himself writing things down, on the backs of envelopes. He created systems, markers, breadcrumbs. She noticed. One morning, she reorganized the spice rack, something she hadn't done in years. He stood in the kitchen, watching the neat rows, and understood that she wasn't doing it for herself. He began to rely on these small clues. The way she laid out his shoes before his walks, the way she placed the bills in order of urgency, the way she now left the morning paper folded open to the obituaries, as if preparing him gently for the inevitability of being reminded. Their silence deepened again, not with distance, but with weight. It was not the silence of 2 people avoiding each other. It was the silence of 2 people preparing for something unnamed. The garden bloomed unevenly. Some things came back stronger than others. The tulips were erratic, but the zinnias burst in thick color. The rosebush came back, half dead. It took her hours to coax it back into form. He sat on the porch during these hours, watching her hands, the way they moved with confidence in the soil. She didn't glance at him, didn't ask for help, but his gaze followed her across every inch of the yard. There were days when he forgot what month it was, but in his mind, the calendar started to blur. He would close his eyes to nap in April and wake with the feeling of August. He'd step into the garage and expect to see the snow shovel leaning near the door. His mind kept folding in on itself, gently, like pages worn to thin. One evening, he left the kettle on too long. The whistle screamed until she appeared in the kitchen doorway. Eyes steady, unmoving. He turned it off, slowly, hands trembling. Neither of them looked at the clock. After that, she took over the morning routine. She boiled the water. She placed the cream just where he used to. He sat at the table. Their son visited more often now. He brought printout. One afternoon, He came with a pamphlet about memory care, but he didn't leave it behind. Just held it in his lap. There was nothing to say, not aloud. But after he left, she threw out the expired cans in the pantry. He cleaned the lint trap in the dryer with slow, careful hands. There came a night, weeks later, when he did not remember the layout of the bedroom. He had gotten up to use the bathroom, as he did every night. But this time, he stood too long in the hallway. The door handles felt unfamiliar. He simply stood still, waiting for the shape of the house to return to him. It was her movement that found him. Soft, slow, the whisper of slippers on carpet. She reached past him, not touching gun, opened the correct door. He entered. She closed it behind him. No words passed between them, but in that moment, the silence felt holy. Spring edged toward summer. The air thickened. The porch took on its familiar dusk warmth. The fans came out from the closet oscillating. The shuffle in his gait had grown more pronounced. He began writing fewer notes. The list of things to remember had outgrown the space in his pockets. The notebook in the garage lay unopened. She stayed close, always near, never hovering. She adjusted his chair when he wasn't looking, turned off the faucet, guided him gently with the placement of things rather than hands. And when he stared too long at the garden without remembering what they'd planted, reminding him not of what they were, but that they were there, still blooming, still theirs. The days began to repeat, not with boredom, not exactly erosion, a gentle smoothing of edges, the kind of repetition that wears away urgency, until all that's left is the ritual itself. Wake, dress, tea, chair, the same radio station, hummed through the kitchen each morning, offering weather reports and gospel hymns in equal measure. The forecast barely mattered anymore. She never did. They had long since stopped marking the calendar. Seasons came by. Smell now cut grass. Time had stopped being measured in days and started being measured in effort. How long it took to put on socks. How many steps to the porch. How many pills in the little white container, organized by colored lids and days of the week. The act of remembering had become physical. He was tired more often. It crept in quietly. Once, he poured water into the coffee canister instead of the kettle. She cleaned the mess without pause. No sigh. Just a dishcloth. Sometimes, minute by minute, he would ask himself what day it was. Several times. Sometimes in the same hour, without ceremony. She left notes not to correct. Sticky tabs appeared on drawers. Arrows were taped to light switches. The house, gently, silently, reoriented around him. He didn't resist, not in the clinical sense. He didn't name it, but in the bones of him, he knew. And in his knowing, he began watching her more openly now. Not with the old weight of resentment or distance, but with something closer to gratitude. She moved through rooms with purpose, not rushed, not impatient, only steady, like a lighthouse beam sweeping through fog. Their proximity shifted, not for warmth. When her hand brushed his shoulder, reaching past him, he didn't flinch. When she paused beside his chair to refill the humidifier, he leaned slightly in her direction. She had stopped humming. Not completely. Her focus was sharper now, narrowed to his needs before her own. In her shoes, lined up by the door, in the medical forms, filled out neatly and tucked into folders, in the way she packed snacks for the waiting room appointments. He was forgetting more. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Once, he left the front door open. The wind carried in leaves. She returned from the pharmacy to find him sitting in his chair, oblivious. Her coat was damp. She closed the door. That night, the latch was double-checked. Twice, there came a stretch of days in early summer when the air outside became too thick to ignore. The news warned of heat. The sun called more frequently. He offered suggestions. She filled pitchers with water and left them in the fridge. He carried a fan from room to room like an old companion. She placed frozen peas behind his neck while he dozed. He never asked why. He simply accepted the chill and closed his eyes. Sat longer. And in that slowness, the house felt smaller. Not claustrophobic familiar. Like returning to a room you once loved as a child, now seen from a lower height. She began sorting through closets. He watched from his chair, eyes following the motions of her hands. She touched things gently: old shirts, unused blankets, a jacket from a trip they had taken long ago to a beach. Neither of them remembered fully. She folded everything with quiet care. Not to discard, just to make space. In July, not a surprise, not unexpected, just a formality dressed as news. There would be follow-ups, tests, adjustments. They all said the right words. Manageable. Early stage, structured care. But he knew what it meant. He couldn't remember what he'd had for lunch. He couldn't follow the instructions on the pill bottles unless she wrote them down 3 different ways. He began sleeping more. She adjusted the blinds. She put on the television, low, tuned to nature documentaries or antique appraisal shows that didn't require memory. The silence between them remained, but now it held a different shape, like hands around a flickering match. He took her hand once, not out of affection, not spontaneously, just as a reflex. He reached for the sugar bowl and instead found her fingers. He didn't pull away. She didn't move. They sat like that for almost a full minute, neither one acknowledging the moment. And then it passed. But the gesture stayed, a memory planted, even as others were beginning to fade. The yard had grown wild. The hedge wasn't as neatly trimmed. The grass went a few days longer between cuts. Weeds crept up through the brick path by the garage. The zinnias grew sideways. The garden had become more honest, less tended. She still pulled the worst of the weeds, still clipped the dead blooms, but she no longer tried to keep it perfect. It was never meant to be. He sat nearby. He used to count the birds that visited the feeder. Now he just listened to their calls, letting them wash over him like background music he could no longer name. The sun came by one evening, bringing food they didn't need and forms they didn't want. He stayed longer than usual, talking at a measured pace. She made tea while he rearranged the stack of mail near the front door. Later, after the house had settled and the television had clicked off, she stood at the sink in the dark. He watched her silhouette from the hallway, her shoulders drawn slightly, not angry, just still. He stepped back into the room without a sound. She didn't turn, but she knew he was there. That night, they lay in bed, a little closer, not touching. The silence between them no longer required translation. It had become its own language, but of everything they still held. The summer didn't break with a storm. It just ended. One morning, the porch was cooler. The light came through the curtains at a different angle. There were fewer insects clinging to the screens. The crickets, once deafening, had grown sporadic and half-hearted. The sky looked paler. It was late August, though neither of them had marked the calendar in months. The days had continued their procession, a mixture of cut grass, aging wood, and something faintly medicinal, like a waiting room. She began preparing for fall earlier than usual. Blankets were washed and folded at the foot of the bed. The furnace was checked. The summer clothes, worn and faded, were boxed with a label in her careful, curved handwriting. New slippers arrived in the mail. He wore them without question. He'd stopped reading the newspaper, not for lack of interest. The articles ran together. The names no longer stuck. He would read the same paragraph 3 times and still not recall what it meant. She moved it from his chair to the kitchen counter and eventually stopped placing it all together. Instead, he watched. He watched her in the mornings as she moved through the kitchen with a rhythm refined by decades. He watched the slow way, her hands wrapped around a cup. He no longer knew the recipes, but he recognized the movements. His attention became sharper, but she, her hands, her posture. She was the thread he could still hold. When he napped, which was often now, she stayed nearby. She didn't hover. Folding towels in the same room, writing lists in her small lined notebook, always within the field of his fading awareness. And when he woke up, disoriented us, and then he would be still again. She started reading aloud. Just lists, notes, reminders, things that used to be left in handwriting. He didn't always respond. The sound of her voice, absent for so long, entered the house like a forgotten tune. Not melodic, not expressive. He began to nod more, even when she wasn't looking. She read labels, appointment times, medication instructions. She read things he no longer processed completely, but somehow understood. And as she spoke, it simply stepped aside. There were new routines now. He used a walker, at first just inside, then outside, where the porch steps were fitted with a rail. She installed herself without asking. He gripped it tightly, not trusting his knees. She stood nearby. The garden became harder to reach. He didn't complain. He sat by the window instead, watching the wind move through the flowers. They'd grown wild again, and small vases appeared around the house. Lavender in the bathroom, a single daisy in a jelly jar near his chair. Colour returned to the rooms. Even as his sight dulled, the sun began coming on Tuesdays. More regular now. He checked the furnace, brought groceries, cleared out the old freezer in the garage. His face always carried a practiced calm, but his eyes moved, constantly scanning, measuring, noting things he never said aloud. He spoke more to her than to him now, but she never left the room when they talked. She listened, then acted. After he left, she moved more slowly. not from fatigue, but from thought. She rearranged things, cleared shelves, set aside drawers to be emptied. Her hands stayed steady. He watched her through it all, but he remembered her. The season began its last turn. Leaves browned early. The trees across the street lost shape, then shadow. The porch furniture was covered. The fan returned to the hall closet. The light through the house took on that late fall, Unsolved. One afternoon, she sat beside him. She picked up his hand, not with sentiment. It was thinner now, his skin like dry paper, the veins prominent, the knuckles oddly regal. She held it in both of hers and traced the shape of his thumb, as if checking for something only she could feel. He didn't react. He didn't speak, but his breath slowed. That night, she left the bedroom door open. He slept in the recliner now. It was easier on his back, easier on her to check on him. She adjusted the blanket over his legs before going to bed and left the lamp on low. He didn't wake when she did. But sometime around dawn, he stirred. The sound of her in the kitchen quiet. And for a moment, everything made sense again. The window, the chair, the faint smell of toast. There are certain things you can only say by staying. She never left. Not during the lean years, but because the space between them had become something she understood too well to abandon. He had once filled the house with sound footsteps, for decades, and now, presence again. But softened, aged, fragile, still there, still enough. They sat near the window that evening as the sun dropped behind the trees. Neither moved. The world outside rustled, shifted. Inside, everything held. The first real frost came without warning. A full freeze, the kind that seals the soil and whitens the branches before sunrise. The kind that doesn't melt by noon. The old maple in the front yard stiffened overnight. Its final leaves curled and fell in one slow exhale. Even the squirrels moved differently, as if they sensed the house was holding its breath. Inside, the silence deepened once more. Not with tension, not with coldness, but with finality. He stayed in the recliner now, always. The bed had become too difficult, too far, too much effort. She arranged the cushions, tucked a blanket across his legs that never stayed in place, brought water in a heavy glass with a straw bent just so. He could no longer dress without her, could no longer find the bathroom in the dark. His memory had thinned to threads. He still knew her, but not always in the moment. Sometimes she was a neighbor, sometimes a nurse. Once, she was a childhood teacher, but never a stranger. And sometimes, late in the afternoon, with the sun coming in low and gold through the curtains, he would blink at her long and slow and remember everything, just long enough for the smallest nod. She never corrected him. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like devotion. He spoke rarely now, not always coherent, mostly sounds, breaths. His voice had shrunk down to a whisper. She heard every sound. She adjusted routines with precision. Pills in applesauce, button-down shirts replaced with pullovers. She installed rails in the bathroom. She accepted help. The core of his care remained hers. She kept a notebook now, not for her thoughts, for his schedule, the times he ate, slept, drank, coughed, woke. She charted his rhythms like weather, attentive to every change in pressure. Sometimes she sat beside him and did nothing at all, not because she had nothing to do, but because being next to him had become the most important thing left. The television stayed off. The windows stayed open. He seemed to sleep better when the air moved. There was one day, no wind, just an unmoving blanket above the house made the living room feel like dusk, even before lunch. The lights were dim. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. She sat in the rocker. The sun had visited earlier in the week. There was no appetite, no ceremony. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the room felt different. Not colder, not quieter, just changed. She looked over. He was still. His hands resting loosely in his lap. His head was tilted slightly toward her, as if he had dozed off mid. She didn't move right away. She watched, waited, counted the seconds between the stillness, and then, gently, she stood. She didn't call out, didn't gasp. She stepped forward, carefully, as though not to wake him. She touched his hand. The silence in the house did not deepen. It had nowhere further to go. In the days that followed, neighbors left cards. The living room filled with people whispering in the voice reserved for death. The house, so used to being a sanctuary of quiet, now swelled with voices, condolences, stories, remarks about how long they'd been together, how remarkable the bond must have been. She nodded, accepted, returned dishes. She said nothing at the silence. She did not justify it. She did not fill it in with something easier to understand. She simply kept it. He was buried on a cold, bright day. The kind of winter morning where your breath comes out in thick clouds and the grass crunches underfoot. The sun read something at the cemetery. The grandchildren stood stiffly in dark coats. A few leaves blew across the path. She stood near the head of the casket. Her eyes never left the ground. No fanfare, just the slow undoing of the last 24,000 mornings. The chair remained for a while. So did his slippers, placed neatly beside it. She left them there, not out of sentiment, but because the room didn't look right without them. Like a photo missing its frame, she began moving more slowly. Not from age she'd. The routines she'd kept for so long no longer had purpose. No tea to make. No pills to sort. No blanket. She began walking each morning. Past the old mailboxes. She walked until her legs hurt. She started playing the radio again. Sometimes static. The noise filled the space that had once been occupied by the hum of his breathing. Still bought the same cereal. Still laid out the paper each morning, even if she didn't read it. The garden bloomed in spring. Let the zinnias take over. There are things that live beyond words. A quiet breakfast. A 40-year absence of speech. So heavy it becomes present. She never told anyone what their silence meant. Not the grief counselor who stopped by and gently suggested talking things out. There had never been anything to talk out. Only things to live through. And now only things to carry. In silence. The house remained. It didn't creak any louder. It didn't sigh under the weight of memory. It simply continued. Walls, standing, curtains, drawing in the light each morning, like they always had. The porch, still caught the afternoon sun. The window still rattled when the wind changed. Dust gathered, as it always had in corners, on sills, in the unseen spaces behind furniture. She stayed, not because she didn't know where else to go, but because it was where her life had unfolded. The house had held their marriage. It had absorbed every footstep, every unspoken argument, every shared breath. To leave it now would be to unravel something too tightly woven. She didn't speak more now than before. Some expected she might, that after so many years of silence, her voice would come rushing out like a tide long held back. But it didn't. She still moved quietly, still drank her tea without sound, still took her walks at the same slow pace, her shoes pressing soft prints into the sidewalk. Neighbors said good morning. The mail came. She sorted it. The son still visited, less frequently now. His grief, though different, ran alongside hers. He asked fewer questions. He had, in the end, made peace with never fully understanding them. He knew what they had looked like, and that was enough. She cleaned out his things over the course of a season, not all at once, not with ceremony, just slowly, deliberately. She kept some of his clothes, not out of need. The faint trace of something no longer available in stores or memory, the recliner stayed. She sat in it sometimes, but never at the same hour he had. That time belonged to something else. There were moments when the silence felt different, not heavier, like the space in a room after someone has left it, but the warmth of their body still lingers in the air. She felt that warmth in the most unexpected ways. In the garden, when the wind knocked over a pot she had just placed. In the hallway, when she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and for a second didn't recognize the woman who looked back. In the sound of the kettle whistling, just a few words. Never to anyone in particular, but to herself. To him, maybe. It was hard to say. The words never lingered. They dissolved the moment they left her lips. But even then, the silence was never broken, because the silence had never been emptiness. It had been the space they lived in together, the place where grief had softened into coexistence, where love had taken on new shapes. She continued to write lists. 4 letters she never sent. She still wrote his name at the top of some, before catching herself. She never crossed it out. Just let it sit there. The garden overgrew. The mailbox leaned slightly forward. Paint peeled from the porch rail. She let it all happen. Not out of indifference, out of acceptance. Things fade, but not everything. Like the memory of his breath in the other room. Like the echo of a chair scraping the floor. Like the simple, steady fact that he was once here. That they were once here, and that the silence between them was never a void. Not romantic, just real. Lived, held. The house still stands. It carries the quiet with it. And if you were to walk past on a spring afternoon when the light falls just right on the porch, a stillness, not cold, not sad, just complete. This wasn't a love story, not in the traditional sense, not the kind where feelings are declared, reconciliations are triumphant, or long-lost letters suddenly arrive in the mail. This was a story about the silence that follows the part of love we usually don't tell. after apologies aren't sad. After people grow so close, they begin to disappear inside the shape of one another's habits. This was about what's left. When communication stops, but the living together continues. About how long a life can stretch in stillness, and how deeply two people can become entangled, even when no longer actively trying. We like stories with answers, with catharsis, with redemption. But sometimes life doesn't arc. It builds in quiet layers. It folds over itself. And yet, meaning still lives there. In glances, in gestures, in toast placed beside a cup of tea, in slippers aligned beside a bed, in a walk taken every morning. People have asked, why didn't they speak? The answer is, what matters is they stayed. And in staying, they spoke a different language. One not made of words, but of presence, of attention. They end the way most lives do. Quietly, still listening, even when nothing is said. If you've ever sat beside someone in silence and felt everything that needed to be, felt that est. This story, and maybe, in some way, it's your story too. Thank you for listening.